Hello everyone, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing our series on attacking the king. And by now, if you've been watching these videos, you notice that we're spending a lot of time looking at the traditional castled position of our king and how we can breach his defenses. So today we're looking at a mating pattern called Lolli's Mate, and this one's from the 18th century. And I want to point out some key factors here. I want you to notice the absence of the traditional knight on f6. Normally we have a knight that begins on the g8 square and it develops knight f6, and it's a key defending piece. And throughout the course of a game, this piece may choose to move, may join an attack against white's king, may get traded off. And so as you're studying your opening theory, your middle game tactics, I want you to notice that a lot of times it's surrounded about getting rid of this knight on f6. By studying a lot of these patterns and you see that theme of the knight being absent, I hope it shows you the value of keeping your knight on the defense as needed. So here we see the idea of what we call the nail in the coffin. Pawns can often march up against the enemy king's territory and create what we call a nail. And let's see what that looks like. When the pawn attacks, he's attacking the square in front of the king, getting ready to support the queen for a checkmate maneuver. Of course, black has an easy response, simply pushing his g-pawn forward. Now we have what's called the nail. This pawn is called the nail in the coffin, and as long as it's there, it is constantly threatening this key square in front of the king. I think the other thing to notice is that after these two moves have occurred, let's back it up. After the pawn marches forward, and then black responds, black's responding by creating a pawn structure that is reminiscent of a fianchetto'd bishop position where in the opening of the game, black would push his g-pawn forward and the bishop that begins on f8 would simply develop to this g7 square, and we would have a monster bishop here that patrols this entire diagonal. So let's make that a little bit cleaner. The monster bishop would patrol this diagonal. And the importance of that bishop is that it's occupying a key square and it's defending these weakened, darkened squares. Because as you notice in this position, no pawn can defend these two squares, which is a weakness, allowing white to enter the position. So having a fianchetto'd position, which is this, without your defensive bishop, which we see in the King's Indian defense, the Sicilian Dragon defense, the Perch defense, many more, is a huge weakness, and we want to spot that, and that's where Lolli's mating technique can really come into play. So here white has a simple maneuver, just bring the queen over and threaten to enter for checkmate. Well, as you can see, black doesn't have a whole lot that black can do. Blockaded, 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 doesn't matter because that doesn't stop the checkmate from coming, and right now this queen isn't helping at all. It's not creating a space for this king to run. So no matter what black tries here, it is checkmate. Okay, so as we move forward into the official position of Lolli's mating technique that was published in the 1800s, what we see is white trying to rip this position open. So what if black had the move and he can move into the corner? Why is this important? Because it frees up this square for a rook to occupy and be able to threaten this key square, meaning the queen could not enter the position. Well, Lolli went ahead and entered the position anyways, getting ready for the attack, forcing black to respond by covering. And now, go ahead and pause the video for just a moment and see what you could do as white here to rip open black's defenses and cause checkmate. Hopefully you found queen captures f7 check. The only response is to take, and then the rook says checkmate. You can see this checkmate down the H file with the nail in his coffin. Okay. Looking at this open H file is important because if we back this up to the beginning and we see this fianchetto'd position, it is quite common for white to try and find some way to rip open the H file. A lot of times they're going to have a pawn on H2 that will march to H4, it'll march to H5, it will capture at the head of the pawn chain, and after the H-pawn captures back, we would end up having a similar situation to this, where the H file is completely open. And that gives an opportunity for a rook. Now this especially happens a lot if white did not castle kingside, because the rook is already on its starting position, threatening down the h-file. And of course the pawn that marched from h2 all the way down here has a fun nickname called the can opener, and we'll learn that in a different video. So moving on, let's talk about pin to win. There's a popular phrase in chess called pin to win, where you pin a piece or a pawn so it cannot move, and it gives you access to a square you normally would not have. You especially have to watch out for pinned pawns. I think for some reason with chess players, they're the hardest ones to see. They're the most easily missed. And we see this here again in Lolli's checkmating technique. So the queen comes in, trying to gain access for the checkmate. Black defends. Okay. White sacrifices the queen. And now the rook would really like to come here and say checkmate. But the rook is very concerned about this pawn covering this square. But do you see the pin? The bishop is pinning the pawn to the king. This pawn cannot move, therefore, checkmate. So you want to keep an eye out for pins in Lolli's checkmate pattern to give you access to this h-file. Let's look at another pin that often happens in Lolli's mating technique. In this position, again, we have the nail. Queen moves in, rook defends, and now we have a different pin. This rook is pinning this rook to the king, meaning it cannot attack this square. And since this rook cannot attack this square, that means our queen has access to, say, checkmate. So black only has two moves here. If black were to push this pawn, well, then it's checkmate. Why? Because this rook cannot capture this queen. Why? Because the pin. Okay, so that didn't work. Well, maybe the rook needs to capture this rook. Well, now the rook has been lured away through the technique of either decoy or deflection, whichever one you want to call it, allowing checkmate. So that rook pin is also a really great idea. Well, I hope this helps you understand the idea of Lolli's mate. We can look again here at the nail in the coffin. Simply attacking, defending, maneuvering into the position, and checkmate. We can see it again in this sacrificial pattern. King steps to the corner, queen's ready, rook defends, sacrifice, opening the h-file, checkmate. Now there's something I wanted to encourage you with before we go today. I encourage you to review this video a few times, practice the key positions and techniques with a friend, continue repeating them again and again until they become a part of your games, because remember, you are what you repeat. Until next time, I'm Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club.